Welcome to the Knowledge Entrepreneurs Show, where we celebrate the innovators driving change in the education industry. At Edison OS, we've worked with over 500 knowledge entrepreneurs to turn their edtech ideas into profitable businesses. Hey, Brett, welcome to the Knowledge Entrepreneur Show. Thanks so much for taking time out for this.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Brett. So, Brett, my first question is as reading a little bit about Dominate Test Prep, you started off primarily with GMAT and then you seem to have expanded into a lot of tests. How did that happen?
Well, I had started teaching for another test prep company while I was in graduate school. I went to the University of Denver. I was pursuing my master's, and I was just looking for some extra part-time income, help pay the tuition, and utilities while I was a newly married guy in Denver, Colorado, and responded to an ad looking for a GMAT instructor. Now, I had taken the GRE to get into graduate school, had gotten a great score, got some scholarships because of my GRE score. They were looking for a GMAT instructor. When I interviewed, they liked my teaching style. They knew I could take tests well. And so they sort of trained me on the GMAT. And so I taught for them for a number of years and actually mostly taught the GMAT. And so I ended up getting, a 98th percentile score on the GMAT, grew to know that test really, really well. And so once the owner of that company sort of went a different direction, it freed me up to start Dominate Test Prep, which I did. And so I started with the GMAT for two reasons. One, it's the test that I knew the best at that point. And two, there was a lot of demand. At that point, back in 2010, the GMAT was really the exclusive exam for business school. There was a lot of demand. There weren't as many test prep companies. I was one of the first to market for the online test prep space. And so it was just a natural fit for me to build out curriculum and video content for the GMAT.
Got it. And how did you include other tests? Were there organic demand, or did you see that, the new tests got introduced and you wanted to include them as part of your thing, or was it based on the trends?
Yeah. So now, obviously, Dominate Test Prep, we provide test prep services for the GMAT, the GRE, the LSAT, the executive assessment, a little bit of SAT and ACT. And so when you're growing a company, there are a couple of different ways you can do that, right? If you want to grow your revenue, if you want to grow your business, you can either go deeper in your current vertical and get more market share for what you're already doing, or you can go wide and in that case expand to different tests. And as great of a market as the GMAT was back in 2010, 11, 12, the total number of GMAT test takers isn't actually all that large compared to some other standardized tests. Now, it might seem like, hey, 260, 280,000 people is a lot of people. At the time, I think 300,000 plus was sort of the high watermark for the GMAT. But really only a certain percentage of those are going to take a test prep company, and only a certain percentage of those will choose me over somebody else. And
Right.
so if you really want to grow your business, to my way of thinking, you had to go wide. And so the next natural place for me to go was the GRE because I'd been teaching that as well. It's the test that I had taken myself and gotten a great score on. There's a lot more test takers for the GRE because it caters to sort of a wider base of graduate applicants, grad school applicants. And so it was the next logical place to go was to go into the GRE. And then we have since added some other tests as well. And so part of its demand, somewhat recently, the GMAC, which is the organization that puts out the GMAT, added the executive assessment as sort of a niche exam for executive MBA programs. And it's very similar to the GMAT. And so that was also a natural extension for me to move into because I already had a lot of the content that would overlap. I knew that exam pretty well right out of the gate. It's a very small pool of people taking that exam. So, I wouldn't build an entire prep company around the executive assessment, but that's just sort of the way business goes, right? You just sort of organically flow where different opportunities present themselves. And so, yeah, I've largely stuck in the grad school space.
Got it, Brett. Makes sense. And currently, what's your split like? What's your major source of revenue amongst all the tests?
Yeah, I mean, despite what I just said about not building an entire company around the executive assessment, I don't think it's more than 50% of my revenue is coming from the executive assessment, but it has grown to where it's a significant percentage of my
Wow.
revenue.
Okay.
And I think the reason is because there aren't quite as many competitors. I was one of the first test prep companies to sort of move into the executive assessment space. And so, yeah, I have a pretty good presence on YouTube and SEO and some blog posts I've written. And so I think people find me for the executive assessment. So even though it's, like I said, a very small pool, I think I have a larger share of the market for the executive assessment than obviously the GMAT or the GRE, where there's some other big players. And so for me personally, I do get a fair bit of revenue there. And then GMAT's still, predominant, and then the GRE, a little bit of GRE, a minor amount of LSAT at this point, mostly because I haven't put a lot of marketing efforts into it. And I'm not the main driver of the LSAT course. I've partnered with a guy who helps me with the LSAT curriculum, and so I think that's part of it, is that I'm not driving the LSAT as hard as some of the other tests.
Got it, Brett. And Brett, before we move forward, dominate test prep. Like, was it a hard choice? Did you have to think a lot, or was it an impulsive decision?
No, I don't remember it being a hard choice. So it started with a GMAT, and this is, I know we're talking to people who are thinking about building businesses and building online businesses, and I'll tell you sort of one of the mistakes I made early on was I didn't think big enough right out of the gate. I didn't allow room to grow beyond how I started, and it's because when I first started, I assumed, hey, I'm just going to build a course around the GMAT. It's sort of a funny backstory. I was driving across Nevada after climbing Mount Whitney, and it was kind of the middle of the night, driving through the desert, listening to some personal growth CDs at the time, kind of before digital, audio. And the guy I was learning from, he asked a question that really just sort of shifted me in this direction. I just had a sort of a traditional job at the time, and he said, what do you know that somebody would be willing to pay you $100 for? As a rhetorical way of getting you thinking about, how can you build something? Can you build a business? Can you sell something that you already know? It's sort of this idea of knowledge, um, the knowledge verse for e-commerce. And it really just, I thought about that a second. I said, well, I know the GMAT really well. I'm already teaching it part-time. And so all of that to say, I started with a GMAT. And my whole thought at the time was, I'm going to build a course around the GMAT. I'm going to record videos for the GMAT. It was all about the GMAT. And so it was, I'm going to help students dominate the GMAT. I just like the word dominate. And so it was, hey, I'm just going to start with dominate the GMAT. And that's where I focused in my whole business, my whole original website, dominatethegmat.com. It was all about the GMAT. And after a couple of years and having built that out and having some success, then it's like, okay, well, now I want to do the GRE. Well, shoot, what do I like? What do I do now? I'm dominate the GMAT. All my branding is dominate the GMAT. My websites dominate the GMAT. My YouTube channels dominate the GMAT. And so then I sort of built a separate dominate the GRE. And then all of a sudden it becomes very cumbersome because now I have multiple websites and multiple YouTube channels and from an online marketing standpoint, there is actually some wisdom to that. You talk about microsites and niche,
Right.
niche marketing and things like that. And so I think I actually got an SEO boost for doing it that way. So it's not to say that it necessarily was the wrong way to do it in the beginning. But then when I added the LSAT and the SAT, all of a sudden it becomes, okay, am I really going to manage 10 trillion things, or should it be under the umbrella, a larger umbrella? And so I think it was maybe around 2014 that I started Dominate, or rebranded under Dominate Test Prep. And, each of those individual sites still operates independently, but I do now have the larger brand and the larger umbrella for all of the tests under Dominate Test Prep.
That's a nice story, Brett. Uh, but yeah, also probably, dominate test prep now makes sense. Dominate the GMAT, dominate the GRE, dominate everything, and now it's dominate test prep. Great stuff.
Exactly.
But Brett, one of the other interesting thing about you is that largely a lot of people did online teaching mainly because of the pandemic that happened in 2020. But you started it way before. So how was it for you during 2020? Was there, an extra demand for you, or didn't you feel any impact or change at all?
Not because of the fact that I was already online. A lot of companies, a lot of the big name test prep companies had already created online versions of their courses before 2020. The only real thing that I joke about is everybody flocked to Zoom, and I'd already been using Zoom to deliver my
Right.
online tutoring for years. So I just sort of laugh about that a little bit. But no, I think the transition, the shift towards online education had already started and then it accelerated in 2020. I would actually say that though the impact of the pandemic and the government lockdowns and everything actually impacted my business in a negative way, I think as it did a lot of test prep companies.
Oh,
So
okay.
while you would think that perhaps, hey, more people found me because I was already online and well established, that might be true. But if you'll remember, in 2020, all of the universities basically paused the requirement of even requiring tests, standardized tests for admission. And so the demand pool dried up almost overnight. They said, hey, this application cycle, you don't even need to take the GMAT. You don't even need to take the GRE. We're going to waive the SAT requirement. And so now it's like, okay, well, great. I'm online. People know me, but nobody needs to take this test. And so, yeah, I think almost everybody saw a revenue hit because of that. So I think that was the biggest impact. And it has slowly started to come back, but not to pre-pandemic numbers in terms of the demand for these
Oh,
tests
not
because
yet.
no, not yet. Because a lot of
Oh, wow.
in the undergraduate space, almost all of the schools have realized the folly of going test optional. I mean, we could have a whole separate conversation and debate about
Right.
the wisdom of even doing it. I understood logistically at the time, if people couldn't go to test centers, they can't go to test centers. And so they can't take the test. I get it. And so the GMAT and the ETS, they all scrambled to deliver online versions of their exams. So that was a major change that happened, right? Students can now sit at home and take the GMAT or take the GRE. And the pandemic sort of accelerated that, but it didn't change the fact that, hey, just because they can now take it online, a lot of the schools had already decided, yeah, we're going to be test optional anyway. You don't even necessarily have to take the GMAT to apply. That doesn't apply to the top 10, top 15 schools. A lot of them still need to figure out how to differentiate among the highest caliber applicants. But a lot of sort of the second tier and third tier schools waived the requirement, and some of them still haven't even brought it back. Undergrad has realized, okay, that was stupid. It didn't work. We need an objective sort of third party way of filtering through tens of thousands of applicants. Let's bring back the SAT and ACT. The graduate space hasn't fully come back to pre-pandemic levels.
Wow. And talking about which, I just happened to stumble upon it a while back in the US. The government is removing or banning the Department of Education. Am I correct? That's the latest that I read. And is that going to have some sort of an impact,
It
Brett, on
shouldn't
what you
have
do?
any. I mean, I think it's probably going to have a very positive impact on education in the United
Oh,
States, but we don't need
wow.
to get
Okay.
in. Yeah, we don't need to get into politics. They're not, though, getting rid of the Department of Education, but they're trimming the fat from the Department of Education. They're just objectively looking and
Right.
yeah, they're just
Right.
looking at the billions and billions of dollars spent on education, and yet educational performance in the United States has been on a steady decline for decades. So the question is, what do we do? How do we increase education in the United States? Do we move towards enabling people to go to private schools? Do we just restructure the public school system? But all that's really happening now is they're just getting rid of a lot of bloat. But it shouldn't impact standardized testing, I wouldn't think. The real question is, why are SAT scores down in the United States? Why are ACT scores down in the United States compared to other parts of the world? Does it reflect on the fact that kids aren't being educated well in our public school system? And if there's not, like, what has the Department of Education been doing? So we're trying to figure that out here in the United States. And maybe all the more reason why people are using test prep companies to say, hey, there's a major deficit in my kid's math education and ability to read and write. I need an external tutor to help train him so he or she can get into college. So I guess potentially if if some of the things happening right now actually improve the education system, maybe students will do better on these things organically, and maybe there will be less demand in the future for SAT and ACT prep companies. Who knows? But
Makes sense. Thanks, Brett, for that view. And Brett, one of the other things is not a lot of people that I speak to, are very active in terms of marketing, right? Like, being present on social media and stuff like that. Most of them bank on word of mouth and referrals, and they swear by that. But you seem to have, YouTube, you spoke about blogs, SEO, and stuff like that. What's your split when it comes to source of students? Is it word of mouth referrals, or does YouTube help you in student acquisition?
yeah, I'm actually talking to somebody later today who found me because he was referred by somebody who had taken my course a couple of years ago. And so I definitely get referral clients. Absolutely. That's important. That's really the goal, right? If you provide a good
Right.
service and you do a good job for people, hopefully they're telling their friends about you. But I think for me, it's more philosophical. It's why do I exist as a business? And my existence as a business is to add value, to really help people, to help people get into business school or graduate school so they can take that next step to pursue their dreams using higher education as a way to get there. And so for me, it's not so much about, hey, how am I going to drive revenue? That's very much a me focused business mindset. My focus from the outset has always been outward looking. How can I help students? And I
Right.
help students by providing good content, blog posts, answering questions that they have, whether they become my client or not. If they want to know the best time management tips for the GMAT, I'm going to give them that on my blog and on a YouTube video and get thousands and thousands and thousands of people watching it and leaving me comments. Thank you. This helped so much. I'm taking my test tomorrow. This was great. That's really why I exist as a business. And oh, by the way, if some of them then sign up for my course because they see the value I provide, great. So I think it's just a different philosophy of why I do what I do.
Great stuff, Brett. Um, but just going back to that question, yes, I got the point of why you do what you're doing, but has being present on social media benefited you in terms of students reaching out? And if so, what's the rough split like in terms of referrals, YouTube, blog, or do you even track them first of all to figure that out?
I track them to the extent that you can. It's sort of hard to know exactly how
Right. Yeah.
people found me. Now, we could talk about this as well. I do have a survey that I always send my students towards the end of the course, and that's of course self-reported. Students either decide to take my survey or not. So there's potentially some bias into the data I'm getting back from the survey at the end of the course. But I do ask that question, like, why did you choose Dominate Test Prep? And I would say that the majority answered that they found me and chose Dominate Test Prep because of my YouTube presence. And then next would be blogs and things like that. And I certainly have some technical ways of tracking some of that as well. So yes, all of that to say, I think the value that I'm putting out there is sort of the biggest way that people find me, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on blog, less so referrals and word of mouth, and then almost nothing from any sort of paid advertising or traditional advertising channels.
Got it, Brett. And Brett, I mean, you've already answered this question, but I'm just going to see if there's a little more to it. Um, Content marketing is one of the reasons, why people actually upload stuff so that, they are discoverable. But you clearly made it, you made it pretty clear that, you're putting yourself out there to provide value, and whatever happens as a result of it is a side effect, it's a bonus. So do you go out there, so is it enough for students to just watch your videos on YouTube and do well on the test prep, or is it something extra that happens when they take a personal class with you?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's an important question. So let's talk about this a little bit, just from the kind of a business building mindset. Like if you're looking at this, watching this, and you're thinking, I want to start my own business or an online business or something like that. Why do people pay for a course in general? So that's sort of a big picture question that we need to ask ourselves. And in fact, I just had this conversation with my son, he's trying to learn guitar, piano. And so he's sort of teaching himself through YouTube, right? I mean, there's a ton of good free content out there. In today's day and age, if you want to learn something and you're willing to do the research yourself, like you can figure a lot of stuff out absolutely for free. That is true.
Right.
But again, it begs the question, why then would you pay for an actual piano course or a guitar course or a GMAT prep course if I can go to YouTube and watch a bunch of videos to learn how to find the roots of a quadratic equation? What are some of those things? Literally, like I'm asking, right? So I think there's a couple of reasons. Number one, to save time. If somebody has taken all of that stuff that's out there and consolidated it for you and packaged it together in a systematic way so that, yes, I could learn how to master the GMAT on my own, but it's going to take me 100 hours. And I hope that I'm even doing it right. And I hope I'm finding the right videos. And I hope I'm not missing any gaps. And I hope I don't see a question type on test day that I totally didn't even realize was on the exam. And it's going to take me 100 hours to do that. Or I could take Brett's course and he's packaged it all together in 30 hours of videos plus some practice problems that target exactly what I'm going to see on test day. And I can prepare for the GMAT in 50 hours without having the anxiety and stress of trying to figure it out. I'm willing to pay $300 for that. Makes sense?
Right.
So number one is time savings. We do that all the time in our lives. And then number two is just, I think, the quality of the instruction, right? If I'm fishing around on YouTube and there's a really bad video here and then there's a video there that I don't really even understand what they're saying, and then there's, oh, that one's pretty good, I'll watch more of that guy's stuff, but if you can find somebody that explains things in a way that makes sense, that you have access to, and here's the third piece, right? So it's teaching style a little bit. It's simplifying the process so you're not having to try to waste time figuring it out on your own. But then it's also having the human touch of, what if I have a question? What if I'm learning to play the guitar and I can't quite figure out how to get from an A to an E quickly enough? Having somebody to actually show you and grab your fingers and put them on the frets the way they're supposed to, and that's helpful. There's value there. And so if my students get stuck on a problem and they can shoot me an email or send me a text or show up to office hours, that's worth money as well. So all of that to say, that's just sort of big picture business. That's just marketing. Why do people pay for courses? Back to your question though about YouTube. No, somebody can't exclusively fully prepare for the GMAT 100% with my free stuff on YouTube, only because I haven't uploaded 100% of everything I've created. Now, if you go through my YouTube channel on some of my most watched videos, you'll see comments of people saying, I literally only watched the videos on this channel and my score went up 50 points. Like, so that happens, and good for you. Free prep. Yay, But for a lot of people, what happens is they do realize, hey, I'm getting a lot of stuff here, but I bet there's even more in Brett's course, which there is. And oh, by the way, where are the practice problems? And oh, by the way, if I have questions, how do I access you? And so a certain percentage will migrate over to my paid course because they like what they've seen on YouTube or my blog or my podcast or any other places where I provide value.
Thanks, Brett, for this detailed answer. I think this is one of the most important things people miss out. Putting out content is only going to help you get more business. And in your case, you're doing it even more organically because a lot of people, when they work with agencies, they really work from a teaser point of view. You just got to put this much so that, people come for much more things. But the first two reasons that you said were, I think those are the most important reasons. And I think the more transparent you make it to people while you're making the course, yes, I'm putting all these things for free, but here are top two reasons why you probably must consider going for a paid thing if it works for you. Saving time and the human interaction to clear doubts instantly, which is definitely going to be missing if you're watching a recorded video. And Brett, I'll probably, conclude with this topic, which is also a very important topic, is how do you price the pricing structure when it comes to the different things that you have? Is it trial, A/B testing? What's your philosophy?
I mean, this is the age-old question, right? In business, how do you price your product? And it was especially hard back in 2010 when there weren't a lot of online courses for me to even compare myself to. So I would go to, is it okay to if I drop some name? Well, that's fine. I'm not going to drop any
Please, please.
names.
Yeah, yeah, you can drop names.
Well, right. So at the time, right, the big names in test prep were Kaplan and Princeton Review. Yeah, and I had even taken it's a whole separate story. I thought I was going to go to law school, so I actually took I think it was a Kaplan course for the LSAT in a classroom, like old school. After work, go sit in a classroom for 3 hours with textbooks and the whole deal. Didn't end up going to law school, but so those were sort of the major players, and maybe there was a third and a fourth. And when I would look at their websites and try to figure out their pricing, it was like $2,500 for their in-person course. And I'm like, well, what do I do with that? Because I'm an online course. I'm not going to charge $2,500 for like an online course, And so it was a little bit of sort of stabbing in the dark in the beginning. Now there's tons of comps. And so I think part of it is looking at what others in the industry are charging for their course. But here's the biggest thing that I've learned is you absolutely do not want to just compete on price. So I made the mistake at one point of just trying to be the cheapest option. And I realized that
Right.
actually doesn't really work because there's a perception of value in your pricing. And if you're too cheap, and there are a lot of companies, and here's where I won't name names, but there are a lot of companies out there who are dirt cheap and always offer 40% off, like standard. Every single day I get an email,
Yeah.
40% off. Well, that's just your normal price. Don't pretend you're giving me a discount. You've had 40% off your course for 15 years. That's just your price, right? So don't think we're stupid. But you're trying to be the cheapest. So if you're going to be the cheapest, like if you're going to be a McDonald's cheeseburger, you'd better sell millions of them if you're going to make a
Right.
lot of money.
Right.
Or you can be a premium cheeseburger and you don't have to sell as many. But oh, by the way, the premium cheeseburger tastes a lot better. And I'm willing to pay $15 for a good cheeseburger, even though you're offering me a Big Mac for $5. Like, I don't want your Big Mac for $5. Does it make sense? I want quality. And so I'm not the most expensive, but I'm also not the cheapest, but I try to emphasize the value that you're going to get with my course. And so I'm pretty much middle of the road. The other thing I would say is I did a few years ago attend a conference at the GMAC headquarters. The GMAC is the organization that puts out the GMAT and the executive assessment. And they do a lot of surveys for prospective MBAs, and they just have all sorts of survey data. And I do remember attending a seminar a few years ago where one of the questions that they sort of gathered information about was the average amount a student will spend preparing for these tests. And their aggregate data suggested that the average MBA applicant spends around $300 on test preparation.
Right.
And so I put my middle, I have several packages. I put my middle pack right at $297. So I was like, okay, if the average student's going to spend that, I'll position at least one of my plans right where the average is, and they'll get good video content, practice questions, a few practice tests, everything they would need for right on average with what they're going to be spending anyway. And then I have some premium offerings and some office hours and some add-ons and all that type of stuff. But it's just surveying the marketing. And the other thing you could do is test it too. I did this with tutoring, and I actually got this from a guy. I remember listening. I do a lot of personal development and growth, and listening to guys who do online marketing and stuff like that. And he was
Right.
talking about his coaching services or whatever, and he had the opportunity to bid on a coaching package or whatever, and he was really nervous about charging too much, and so he threw out what he thought at the time was a pretty high number for him, and the people snatched it up instantly, like, okay, perfect, good, you're booked for next week. And he was like, whoa, I probably could have charged more. And then the next time he had an opportunity, he increased it by like 20%. They didn't even blink. They said, yep, boom, you're hired, good. He's like, how high can I go? And he kept raising his prices until it was like 10 times the original, and people were still saying yes. And then at some point, they started to say, oh, okay, well, let me think about it. We're researching some other company. he knew he had reached sort of the upper limit of what people were willing to pay. And I think that I did that a little bit with my tutoring. I was like, nobody's going to pay $100 an hour for tutoring. Oh, I had people signing up left and right. Nobody's going to spend $120 an hour for tutoring. Oh, no problem getting clients, right? There are people in the industry charging $250 an hour for GMAT tutoring, right? So you can keep, as long as you're good, as long as you're providing value, don't race to the bottom. Don't try to be the cheapest player
Right,
because
right.
there's a perception of value in that. So that's one of the things that I've learned.
Got it, Brett. Brett, thanks so much. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much for candidly sharing some of the most insightful learnings from your own experience. It was a
Yeah,
pleasure having you.
yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me, and good luck to everybody out there either building a business or taking these tests.
Thank you, Brett.